Welcome back, guys. This is Roland from Graphic in Motion, and this is part 2 of the Lightbulb Shatter video tutorial series. If you didn't watch part 1 yet, then I consider that you do that right now. Go back, watch part 1, then come back to this video. So what are we going to do in this part of the tutorial? We are going to add some dynamics. We will shatter the light bulb using a Voronoi Fracture object in Cinema 4D, and then we will create this nice explosion effect. So let's jump right to it and let's get started in Cinema 4D. So in this part we are going to shatter our glass, and therefore we will use a Voronoi Fracture object. Let me first of all duplicate my glass here because I need another version that I will keep for later. So let's just turn this off here and let's use this one here to create our glass pieces. Therefore I need a Voronoi Fracture object, and I hold down Alt and it will make my glass automatically a child of the Voronoi Fracture. So now let's just turn off the matrix object, or let's actually really delete it because I don't need it anymore. And I will focus now on the Voronoi Fracture object. You see that by default it already created some pieces here. Doesn't really look like glass, not very realistic, but we will work on that. So let's go to the Voronoi Fracture object, and you see inside the sources here we have a point generator. If we select that, we can increase the amount here, let's say 57 for now, and then we get a few more pieces. That's okay, but it still doesn't look like glass. The technique that I choose here to control the shattering a little bit better is to add additional sources. And in my case, I want to use objects to do that. So let's add in an object, let's add in a sphere. And I will drag this above my Voronoi, and these two will be grouped now. Let's Alt J these to my Shatter, just that I have everything together. Now in my Voronoi object, I want to lock this for a moment so that we have the attributes here all the time, and I will drag in my sphere into the sources. Now if we select the sphere and move it onto our object, you see what's happening here now. Now the sphere is actually adding points and adding pieces here, and this is exactly what I want. But right now it looks a little bit regular, and this is because the sphere is set to, let's take a look here, is set to vertices, and my sphere is a standard sphere, so the vertices are evenly distributed, but we can change this to something better, maybe surface. Surface usually works quite fine. Now let's increase this number here to, let's say, 100 pieces. And if we take a look now at our sphere and move it out a little bit here, and then you see we get some quite interesting shapes now going on. We have these more interesting pieces, and I can of course now change the size of my sphere and see what this does. So you see, depending on the size or depending on the position of the sphere, you can create very different shadows here, and this is pretty cool. Now I have these small pieces down here, and that looks actually really good. So let me quickly orientate myself where I am. Okay, here is my camera. So what I definitely want to do is I want to position one sphere right here in front. So let's just take this sphere and position it more or less here into the middle so that we get a few more interesting pieces right here. This looks actually really good. And now we can add in a few more spheres to control our fracture. So let's just duplicate this sphere by holding down Control and dragging it down, and then we also add this to our point generator. Now let's change this back to surface, and let's change the number of points maybe to something like 78, just a bit random values here, and let's see where we can put this. So I think that I also want to have a few more additional parts here on the side. Maybe move this a little bit down so that it affects the parts down here a little bit more. Change the size maybe a bit so that we get some random pieces here and there around our sphere. And I will add in some more spheres, and I will speed up the process, and I will be back when I'm finished. Okay, so I think that I'm finished with my Voronoi Fracture setup, if you take a look here, I have some bigger parts here, I have some smaller parts here, and try to make it a little bit more random and bring in a more interesting small parts here towards the camera. So when we add dynamics to this, we will see how this works, and we can always come in here and change this later on because this will stay parametric, and that's really cool. And let me mention, when I created the original template back in 2014, there was no Voronoi Fracture in After Effects, so I had to use different methods. Back then I used a plugin called Throwsy, and yeah, it was also quite good, but definitely not what we have now. So the possibilities now with the Voronoi Fracture are really cool, and this improves the process of breaking stuff quite a bit. So speaking about breaking stuff, now let's add some dynamics here and really break our light bulb. First of all, let me quickly hide my spheres because I don't want these in my viewport. And now we will add in some dynamics, and therefore we go to dynamics or simulation tags, I should say, right here, and add a rigid body to our Voronoi Fracture. Now let's go into this, let's unlock these settings here, and let's go into this fracture or this dynamics tag. And there's one thing that I want to change. Here we have inherit apply tag to children, and we actually don't need this here because we only want it to apply to our Voronoi Fracture. So let's turn this to none. And I also want to change the shape from automatic to convex hull in this case. This should give us a little bit better results here. Then I of course need some ground plane to collide with. So let's add in, let's say for now, just a simple plane, and I just will increase the size to be quite high, maybe 5000 times 5000, so that we have enough space to collide. But actually, if I take a look at this, that's probably not enough. So let's even make this bigger, 7500 times 7500. Let's see whether this is okay. Maybe this is okay for now. We will take a look at that when I apply the explosion effect. But for now, let's add a collision tag, so simulation tag collider body to this, because then this will be our ground plane and our pieces will then collide with it. So we can now just let it simulate for a moment. So let's just turn on our playhead and you see what's happening now. Now the pieces fall to the ground and they shatter when they hit our ground plane. So this is pretty cool, but not what we want. But if we take a look here at the pieces, you see that they look pretty good. So I think that the fracture object or the Voronoi Fracture works nicely and the pieces look not too bad. So that's good. So another important thing is that our pieces also collide with the socket here. So let's add a simulation tag, a collider body tag to our socket as well. And now you see they will break immediately because they are already colliding with our socket and they fall down like this. So the simulation now is of course already a little bit slower, but that's okay. So let me take a look here. I can also turn off apply to, or actually what I could do here, because the socket is actually within a subdivision surface, I could apply the collision tag right to the polygon here, because then this mesh is a little bit easier to calculate and this will probably speed up our simulation a little bit. Yeah, you see now it's a little bit better. So let's just add the tag to our polygon and not to the socket, because we don't need really precise collisions, and probably we won't even have collisions when our explosion is set up, but we will take a look at that in a moment. So talking about the explosion, let's create an explosion. And therefore, I will use a force field. And you can go to these forces by going to simulate, and there you have the forces. And I want to use an attractor. So let's drag this attractor into our shader here. And by default, if we now let this simulate, you see that the attractor is not really doing anything. It's very, very low, the settings. So let's increase this just that we can see what it does. And now it will create probably a little bit of weird behavior. Yeah, you see it's pushing around small pieces here, but of course this is not what we want to achieve. We want to have an explosion. So first of all, let's position our attractor, and I want to position it right more or less in the middle here, maybe somewhere around here. And I also want to set it up in a different way. So I want this to have negative effect because I don't want the pieces to be pushed towards the attractor, but I wanted them to be pushed away from the attractor. So let's set this to a value of -1000 for now. And I also don't want to have an acceleration mode, but a force mode. And now you will see this will be pretty different. So let's take a look what this does now. And this is now something like an explosion, you know? So now it's pushing apart these pieces very strong, you know, boom, they are flying out like crazy. And this is because now the effector pushes apart these pieces with a strength of 1000 on each frame. And this is of course too much for us. We want to create an impulse, a short one, and then we want this to be turned off. So let's do this, let's animate this. And as we already know, because here we have our markers, that the explosion will happen at exactly 125 frames, we will animate this right here. So let's go to frame number 124 and let's set the strength of our attractor to 0. Now let's move forward one frame and let's set it to -1000. I may have to change this value later on, but for now I will use this value. Then I move forward 2 frames and set it to 0 again. Okay, now let's take a look what we have. And I will just shorten my timeline a little bit so that I don't have to play the whole thing the whole time, something like that. So now let's re-simulate this. And now you see this looks quite decent. Some parts are really flying off way too far and some are staying nicely within our frame here. So there is this option to change the speed limit. And if I turn this down quite low, just for the reason, just for demonstrating, you see what happens then. Now the pieces don't fly out that far anymore. And the big pieces, they are not flying out anymore at all. So this is not quite what we want, but we can control the speed limit here a little bit. So let's set this to something like maybe 1000. And let's see what this does. Now we still get a nice explosion. Some pieces are flying away pretty fast and far, but the other ones stay quite nicely in our frame. If I go into a camera and take a look now, let's just simulate this with our camera. Yeah, this is actually not too bad. I really like it. I like how this one is jumping towards the camera, spinning. This could be really cool. So I really like it. But for my taste, they fly out a little bit too far. So maybe I have to change our attractor settings a little bit. So let's go into our attractor right here, into the keyframes. Let's zoom in a little bit. And let's try to maybe shift the keyframe where I turn it off a bit forward. So we will just shift it back here so that the impulse is really only 1 frame long. And let's see what this does. This is looking actually a little bit better. I like this. It's not too bad. And maybe I will reduce the force a little bit. So instead of -1000, I may put in here -750. Let's take a look what this does. And this looks actually pretty good. And you see, setting up dynamic simulations always is a trial and error. So you have to put in values, you have to change some things and to get it right. And I didn't put down values on a paper so that I just put them in. I didn't write down anything actually. In the preparation for this tutorial, I made this work, I created this several times, 2-3 times, just to see where I'm going. Because when I created it originally back in 2014, it was quite different to do this project. And now for the tutorial, for this course, I thought I have to prepare a little bit, but I didn't write down all the exact values that work because then you just don't see the process. And this is only about workflow. This is what I want to show you here, a workflow. And actually, I do not even want to show you how to break a light bulb. I would be very happy if you apply the techniques that I show you here to way different projects. So break something else or create, I don't know what out of it. But the light bulb is only an example of a workflow that you can then apply to your own projects. I hope so, at least. So, okay, enough talking around here. Let's continue with our project. So now I'm quite satisfied with this explosion for now. I think that this can create, yeah, a really nice slow motion. there's one thing I have to do, because if I extend my timeline and play it from the beginning, you will see we have one problem. And the problem is that my pieces fall to the ground before our explosion even starts. And this is because our dynamics are enabled throughout the whole project, and we have to change that. So let's go to frame number 124 again and disable our dynamic tag, and let's set a keyframe for that. Now let's move forward one frame to frame number 125, and let's enable our dynamics. And now they will stay in position right where they belong. I really don't know why I have this glitching here always when I go to the start. Strange. But as long as it won't render later on, we don't have a problem. But now you see nothing, and this is because I actually didn't put in the keyframe. That's the problem of the After Effects user, that I'm always used to automatic keyframing. So let's take a look. Now it should work. Now we have our preparation where the light gets, and then, no, something didn't work now. And why is that? So maybe I have to enable it one frame earlier. So let's try this out. So let's set the keyframe here, and let's set the keyframe here. And actually on my dynamics body here, this keyframe I can delete. So now this should work. Let's take a look here whether this works now. Yep, now it works. So it stays in place now, and then the explosion is happening at 125 frames. Okay, so far so good. So there's one little thing that I want to correct. Right now the explosion is affecting all of our pieces, and I don't want this. I want some of them here around the socket to stay in place. And we can do this by using a Mograph selection. So let's select our Voronoi Fracture for now. And actually what we can do is we can turn off these points here now, because they are a little bit distracting. So just in my sources, I will turn off all these points that they are not visible here. And I will go to Mograph selection now. And you see we have these dark or these brown points here around our object. Now I go to my side view and zoom in a little bit. And with my Mograph selection selected, I will change this to rectangle, and I will draw a rectangle around the top part here of my light bulb. And now I have the selection tag here. And if you go to your dynamics tag, then you see we have this field here where I can drag this in now. So drag it in here in the upper field. And if we now take a look at our explosion, you will see that the pieces on the bottom here stay in place. And this is exactly what I wanted to achieve. Let me take a look here how this looks like, whether I like the selection. Actually, I want to add a few more pieces to this selection. Or actually, I have to say, I want to remove a few more pieces from my selection so that they stay here. So this piece, for example, let's just go back to our selection, Mograph selection, and I will change this to brush. So you see here I have this bluish piece here, and I also want this to stay on my socket. So I will just hold down Control and click on this little point to disable it in the dynamics. Now let's move around here and let's see. This one here, for example, could also stay. This looks quite nice. So yeah, I think that this should be it. So let's go back to my camera and let's resimulate. Boom. And now you see we have a nice bunch of pieces staying around our socket, but now it's a little bit too even. So let's remove a few of them. For example, this one here, I will now go back to my Mograph selection, hold down Shift this time, add this one here, and maybe also add this one here. Okay, and I think this is fine. So let's take a look. Boom, yeah, some of them are now staying around our socket and the other ones fly out nicely. So our simulation is nearly done. There are two more things. First of all, I don't like this how they fly out. So it's a little bit boring, you know. Some of them are nicely rotating, but some of them are just flying out, a little bit boring. So let's add in a little bit of initial velocity. And we can do this by using this custom initial velocity option here and turning this on. And then we can add a little bit of angular velocity. So maybe something like 360 on the x-axis. Let's take a look what this does. You see now immediately they're spinning out. They're rotating right in the beginning when our explosion is happening. And this definitely looks a little bit more interesting. And I really like this one piece here that's flying towards our camera. So this will be very cool when we set up our time-lapse effect or our bullet time effect in the next step. So I'm really actually quite happy with this simulation. You see that we still have some problems. Some of them are flying around like crazy, but we will care about these later on. So we will deal with these problems when I set up the basics here. So this looks quite nice. Now let's set up our bullet time effect. So how can we do this? And there is a very cool option. If we go to Control D to our project settings and go to the dynamics, there's this time scale here. And this controls how fast the dynamics are calculated in relation to the time. So let's set this up. I know that in the beginning of the explosion, the time should be normal. Or maybe even I will speed it up a little bit. We will see. So let's take a look here. I will just make a little bit more room here. Boom, so the explosion is exploding out. And then at a certain point in time, I want to create this slow motion effect. So let's say at around 10 frames. No, that's actually too long. So maybe even 5 frames. I'm not sure right now. Let's just start it at frame 135. So what I will do here, on frame 130, I will set a keyframe with a time scale of 100. Then I move forward 5 frames and set it down to a very low number, so maybe something like 20%. And now let's resimulate and let's see what this does. So now the explosion is happening and then everything gets really slow. Boom, you see now we have this really nice effect. Boom. All the pieces suddenly become slow. And I really like that. I'm not sure about the timing. Let me take a look here. Now we are flying nicely through our pieces. No, it's actually really not too bad. And I will turn on my audio for a moment and let's take a look how this works together. It's really not too bad. So I watch it 2 more times and think about things that we can improve here. Maybe I will turn this on a little bit earlier. So let's move these 2 keyframes here just a little bit further up here, maybe 2 frames. And I will also move this keyframe here, maybe in here a little bit. So let's take a look what this does now. Yeah, I think that this is a little better. Boom. Cool. Okay, so this works. Now there is one little problem that I see, and this is that some of them are spinning way too crazy. This one, for example, and this one. It will not be probably that obvious later on, but they are a little bit disturbing. So what I try to do now is to change this in my dynamics a little bit. So there's actually this option to apply a little bit of damping. And you see we have angular damping of 5% in the forces here. And if I increase this maybe to 10%, let's take a look. Maybe this helps a little bit to... No, actually it does not really help. So what we could do, we could try to shift our attractor a little bit. So let's take a look. Let's choose our attractor and maybe shift it down a little bit. And let's resimulate now. It doesn't really have too much of an effect here. What you could also do is just shift this to the side only a little bit. So let's see what this does now. Interesting. I can shift it over a little bit more. That's quite nice. Some pieces are spinning out still a little bit crazy, But actually I like this. And we could also try to shift it on the x-axis, but I have to do this on the right direction. So let's take a look here. And I will shift it back a little bit like this. So let's take a look what this does now. Now it blows the pieces towards our camera even more. And I think that this is pretty cool. So let's take a look. Yes, this is perfect. I really like that because now we have a few pieces really flying towards the camera. And I think that this will look really great later on in our project. Boom. So one little thing, I want to move the keyframes of our time scale again a little bit. So let's select them and let's move them over for one frame. And let's take a look now. My problem, what I don't like 100% is that my explosion is nearly a little bit too slow in the beginning. You know, I would like to have it a little bit faster. So what I could do is instead of having 100 here, 100%, I could put in here 150%. So let's take a look how this works. This should speed up the explosion, and you see that this actually works. Now it's exploding way faster. Boom. And then we are traveling through the pieces. So this is not too bad. But let me go to my attractor and shift it back to the middle a bit more. Something like that. Let's see. Boom. Not too bad. But the small problem that I have now, I don't have these pieces flying towards the camera that nice anymore. So some of them are, but not perfect. So I just keep changing these values a little bit and these keyframes until I have something that I'm satisfied with. So it will speed up this process now, I think. Okay, so now I'm satisfied with the timing of my explosion. It really looks quite nice. And one thing, I will set the attractor right into the middle again on the x-axis, but not on the z-axis because I like it how these pieces are pushed towards the camera. That's really cool. And yeah, I think that this works really nicely. Now we have to speed up our animation because we know that at around frame 200, where our reveal is happening, I want this to speed up again. So we will set a keyframe again for our timescale here. Let's see where there's a right point in time. Yeah, I think that it's okay here on frame 200. Now let's set a keyframe here, 20%. Then let's move forward 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frames probably. And now we'll set this to actually 200% because then I want these pieces to fall down quite fast. Now let's take a look how this looks like in total. Boom, exploding out, and then they fall down. Okay, the 200 is a bit too fast, so let's make it 150. And let's take a look at that. Boom, and then they fall down. So there's one problem that I see in this simulation. Some of the pieces are acting really weird, especially these ones that are rotating like crazy, and some of them are flying around like crazy. So let's work on this a little bit. Let's go to our dynamics tag again, and inside the collision we have this bounce and friction here. So these are glass pieces, so I think that I don't need that high friction value here. I want to set this to 70%, and the same applies for our plane here, you know. Here the bounce is set to 100, so let's turn this down to 5, but let's also turn down the friction around 70%, and let's see what this does now, because then they should probably just slide out a little bit more. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Okay. And to improve the quality of this simulation, what we can do is we can go to our dynamic settings in the project settings with Ctrl-D and go to the expert settings. And here we have this steps per frame and maximal solver iterations per step. And if you increase this, then your simulation would get slower, but will get more precise. So let's do that. Let's increase this quite a bit to maybe 50 for both values, and then let's resimulate. Now this will be way slower, but way more precise, as you can see here. So this looks totally different now. And I think that this is already good for us, you know. this now really looks cool. You see, now they are also not flying out that crazy anymore. So this setting is very important, but depending on your system, it can slow down the process or the simulation process quite a bit. But now I really like this animation, you know, it really looks cool. So we have a really beautiful, beautiful explosion happening. Boom. Traveling through it nicely. That's really good. Now what we can do is we can cache this. So we can select our dynamics tag here, go to cache, and let's just say bake object. And then all these animations will be baked into our scene. So let's bake this dynamics. You see it's very fast, and depending on your system, this might be a little bit slower. I have quite a powerful processor. And now let's take a look. Now we should have real-time playback. So this looks not too bad. It looks cool, but the only problem that I see now is that my explosion is not strong enough anymore. So because I changed the calculation steps, it now calculates it differently and it looks a little bit differently. I want the pieces to fly out a little bit further. So we'll actually go in here and clear my object cache again, and we'll change some settings here. So first of all, I want to go to the attractor, and I will increase this value here again. I set it to -750, but now I will set it back to -1000, and I will resimulate now and see what this does. This should push it out a little bit further. Actually, this is not enough for my taste, so I will increase this even further, maybe -1500. Let's see what this does. It pushes them out nicely, but still not enough for my taste. So how can we improve this? Let's go to our dynamics or to our attractor here, and let's select this keyframe and move it over one frame so that the force can push these apart a little bit longer. So let's take a look whether this has the effect that I want. No, we still don't have it. And maybe this is due to my speed limit. So let's go to the attractor and to the object and change this or increase this to maybe 2000. Let's see whether this is the problem that I've got here. Boom. Yep. That was the problem here, you know. Now I think that this looks way better for my taste. Boom. And now I can probably shift this back in here, this one keyframe. Yeah, and now this looks really nice. So let me take a look at that again. We still have the problems with these pieces that they fly out a little bit crazy. But maybe if I can now change this back to a lower value like -1000, we will still have the same effect. That they fly out nicer. Yeah, that looks definitely better. Maybe I can go back here and change this back to -750. It's always, you know, experimenting, balancing the values. And this looks really good. Boom. Boom. I could sit here for hours and watch this and say, boom, each time it explodes. Okay, so now I'm satisfied with this, and I will go back to my dynamics body or dynamics body tag, and I will rebake my object. And then our animation is finished. So now let's take a look at the whole thing again, and let's turn on the sound and let's see how our explosion is now looking. And I really like it. The only thing that I don't like is that in the end, when the pieces start falling down, I think this is a little bit too late. So let's go in here and let's go to our time scale. Let's select these two keyframes down here and let's just shift them over a few frames. So something like that. And now, of course, I have to rebake my object. So let's do that quickly. Rebake the simulation here. And now let's take a look at it again. Yes, that's better. And now one more thing. I realized in the camera motion that in the beginning I think that the camera motion is just a little bit too slow. So I want to have a little bit more camera motion in the beginning, but this is very easy to change because actually we have our nice align to spline tag here. So let's take a look at that and let's quickly maximize this and press H to frame it. So let's just change the curve here a little bit to something like this. This could now maybe work a little bit better. Let's take a look here. Oh no, it's still not enough for my taste, so we'll go in here and change the value of this keyframe maybe to something like 15% so that we travel in here a little bit further. And now let's take a look again. Yes, that's a little bit better because then we have this little bit of motion before our explosion already, and I think that this looks quite nice. So now, as a last part of our animation part, we will add a wiggle to our lamp that will somehow intensify the building up of this energy. And we will do it the following way. So we have this shader here, this shadow null that I created before, and it is actually sitting right here on the bottom of our object. And this is pretty good. We can use this now to create a wiggle. So let's add in here a tag, and I want an animation tag. I want a vibrate tag. So we want to enable the rotation, and we can wiggle this around, let's see, like 5, 5, 5 for now, and a frequency of 20. So that it wiggles around quite fast. And let's take a look what this does. You see, now this is wiggling like crazy, but the problem is I applied it to the wrong null. Sorry, I applied it to my shader, but I should have applied it, of course, to my light bulb, because I don't want it to affect my shader only, or not only the glass, but the whole light bulb. So I just apply it to this null. So this is where it belongs. Now you see what this is doing. It's wiggling like crazy before it explodes, and then it still wiggles around. And we don't want this, but it looks very funny. So we have to set this up and animate it a little bit. So I think that the frequency of 20 is really good for the end here, but the amplitude is too high. So let's set this back to something like 3, 3, and 3. And now let's create a little bit of an animation. So you see that here when the buzzing gets intense, I want this wiggle to start. So right at frame number 75, I will set a keyframe, and I will set all of this to 0. So I will set the frequency to 0, and I will set the amplitudes to 0. So let's set everything to 0. And let's create 2 keyframes here. Now, until the explosion happens at frame number 25, I want this to be quite or increasing. So let's put in here then 20 as we had before. Let's put in 3, 3, 3. And let's set a keyframe here. Now let's take a look how this looks like. Now it starts wiggling. Boom, and then it explodes. And then the wiggling should stop. And we will do this by just animating these back all to 0 within, let's say, 2 frames. Let's set this back to 0, 0, 0, and 0. And let's create 2 more keyframes here. And let's take a look whether this works. And I think that this works quite nicely. Let me turn off my audio and let's take a look at it without audio, because sometimes the audio is a little bit distracting. Wiggles, wiggles, boom, it explodes, the wiggle is off, and everything is in order. Okay guys, so this was it with part 2 of this tutorial series. We created a nice explosion animation and we shattered our light bulb finally. In the next part, it's time to make this look beautiful a little bit, so we will add some materials using the Redshift renderer. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in part number 3.